Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. We call this a cricket pitch because for many years it's where we play cricket. And I kept the grass cut for a number of years, but then we started to plant a few bulbs into here. The pseudo-narcissus, the wild daffodil, they're delicate, they have charm, quite slow to spread, but worth the wait. And then after that we added crocus, and we've got tulips and alliums and fritillaries, all which will come through in their turn. And to be honest, I think the cricket pitch is now my favourite part of the garden. On today's programme, we visit Nick, who is developing new plans for a garden using containers.
I'm going to use a load of these bacopas, and what's handy about this is garden centres will sell you this as an annual. In actual fact, it's secretly a perennial.
We meet a young couple with a passion for cacti.
The kind of mean-looking plants in my head, they have this like doom metal soundtrack that goes along with them.
It makes me happy seeing him happy.
Francis visits a grower with an alternative way of using cut flowers.
Oh, wow. This is amazing. This is your office.
Yes, it's my office, yeah. It's my studio where I create, and it's also where I dry most of my flowers as well.
Must be nice to come to work here.
Yeah.
And I shall be reviewing my pelargoniums after winter and taking some cuttings. Come on, Nell. Good girl. Come on. Last week, I took out the rosemary that had been acting as a hedge on the mound because it was looking bad and had a viral problem, so I'm starting again. And I'm planting something very different. And I'm recycling some plants I've got here in the long walk, Alchemilla mollis. And the clump that I'm about to dig up has been lain on exactly by Ned. Ned, you might think that's a really good place to lie, but I'm going to dig that up. You don't lie on borders. Good boy. Sit. Good boy. You see, he's getting obedient. Right. Alchemilla mollis is as tough as old boots. It'll cope with shade, it'll cope with sun, it'll cope with drought, it will cope with very wet weather. This is a really good time of year to move any herbaceous perennials that you've got. And the herbaceous perennial is one that dies back completely over winter and then regrows again to its full height and its full flowering during the summer months. Now, although we've got just very tentative signs of growth above ground, below ground there's a really good solid mass of root, and I can divide that up. Now, what we've got here, you can see, is all the growth along the edge of the roots, and that's one of the characteristics of herbaceous perennials. They grow outwards, and all their vigor and new growth moves away from the center, and you get this donut effect of a ring of new fresh growth and absolutely nothing in the middle. So if you dig it up, take the outside and then replant it, you get fresh vigor and better flowers and better performance. Now, it's time to join Nick, because last year he made a big decision in his life. And we joined him last summer as he set about planning a new garden.
Well, I have finally done it. I've jumped ship and moved from London back to my roots in the countryside. I'm just in rented accommodation at the moment, but that doesn't stop me wanting to create a fabulous garden. It just needs to be transportable for the future. So I'm going to do a huge container planting down here and try out a whole load of different experimental ideas. And it also needs to be really economic. So I'm using a whole load of scrap material, basically that I found on the streets, old pallets, old bits of timber, various pots and things I've been donated by friends. I've moved a whole series of different plants from my London garden. and most of them were in sort of large containers to start with. I then also kind of stripped through the garden and lifted all my most kind of precious herbaceous things. This new space is essentially a big blank canvas, and it's about 10 by 10 metres, and it's roughly divided in two. I've made a few tweaks, of course getting the landlord's consent, but I'm hoping by the end of this summer I'll have made this very much my own space. So essentially what I want to do with the plants is stage them or layer them up in steps. So the front layer will be sort of shorter pots sitting directly on the ground. I then want to have a secondary layer, which I will use all of this timber effectively to make a table through here, and then have a third layer at the back. And what it means is it will give me this sort of theatre-like effect. So it will read like a giant herbaceous border. It will give me more instant height straight away. I'm going to use a load of these bacopas, and what's handy about this is the garden centres will sell you this as an annual. In actual fact, it's secretly a perennial. If you're in a relatively warm garden or there's something sort of, fairly free draining and relatively protected, this will just keep on going and going. So it makes a lovely trailing plant. I may well use it in some of the bird cages up there. And then, again, just such useful garden mainstays, these argyranthemums. See, they're absolutely packed with buds around at the bottom, and this will easily bloom, all the way through until November time. One of my sort of real mainstays that I use again and again in gardens, it's Cape Mallow. It's called Anastodontia elreo. And it's the most extraordinary plant. It flowers 365 days of the year. It also grows incredibly fast, so it'll be pushing 2 metres by the end of the season. So they'll form part of the backdrop. Along with a whole load of other plants down here I kind of brought with me. There's this fantastic thing here called Petrina, and that goes from tiny little plant, it's an annual, in spring, up to a 6-foot flowering plant by the end of the year.
I didn't know you were going to do that.
Because I'm going to be here for a short time, I'm just going to do a few slightly mad experimental things. For example, all of these old wooden ladders, you can buy them from salvage merchants for £5 or £10 for a whole ladder. And so I want to use them as sort of structural elements in the garden. So I'm going to get another of these and repeat it further down. The idea would be then to grow climbers up it. The truth of the matter is you can garden with the most rudimentary, basic equipment. And so I needed a growing bench out here. So just found this old table, pallets, bit of this chipboard, some seriously dubious carpentry, but it's just a great way of having a temporary table for no money. In order to sort of supplement all of the perennial plants that I'm growing and some of the annuals I've bought in, I've sown a whole load of stuff myself. I've started a load of dahlias. They're doing absolutely fine back there. Next along the line is a plant I'm completely obsessed with. It's called Mirabilis jalapa, or the marvel of Peru. It's quite late to emerge from the ground. It's brilliant to sort of grow under spring perennials, because as they go over, it then pops up in June time. Next to them, I've got this Lab bean. It's an ornamental bean, so it's sort of deep burgundy, glossy, very pretty, with sort of purpley pink flowers. It's also an incredibly fast climber, so I'm going to put some wire mesh on the back fences, grow that up. I've gone for several different cosmos. This one is called Xanthos. It's a really unusual colour. It's sort of somewhere between yellow and lime, and it looks beautiful against sort of pinks and purples, so we're using that en masse. As well as being a plantsman, I'm also a landscape designer. So I always want to measure up, survey a plot, understand the light track and the underlying soil before I start to do anything. Then I can draw up a scale plan of the plot, and it's sometimes really surprising to see how big the space actually is. Because I'm going to have all of these things in containers, I can arrange the border. If it doesn't look great, swap a few things around. So this is going to be a lovely way to sort of play around with different planting combinations and keep changing them as the season goes on.
I like the ladders, and we'll be paying another visit to Nick's experimental garden in a few weeks' time. Right, now I've got the alchemilla here, I can start to break them up. So if I take out a big clump, and if I take just this little piece off, that I could plant. You can see there's a good root system on it, but I could also make it into 2 plants. They will do fine, so we'll put those there. So we cut that off, and there we've got a nice good sized plant. Perfect, really nice example. There's the centre. Now that is no use. You can see it's got roots, but it's not producing any new growth. So that goes to the compost heap. Okay, so I've got some plants here, and I'm going to go and plant them straight away. But before I do, it's time to visit the first of your gardens this week, and it belongs to one of our younger viewers.
My name is Roisin. I'm almost 7. I live in Letchworth Garden City. I'm going to show you some plants that I've grown from seed and a very special plant to me. This is my big sunflower. It has finally come out, and there's at least 6 more batches that will come out soon. Below my sunflower is some comfrey. Monty showed us how to make some comfrey mixture for the plants to make them grow well. These are aromat tomatoes. They are not circle-shaped, they're oval-shaped. I grew all of these tomatoes from seed, and these green ones here, I hope they're going to turn red. And that's all I've got to say. This is a very special plant. It's called a vinca. These are the tiny leaves of vinca that I used to make the chemotherapy vincristine. I took that medicine because I had leukemia. I just finished it today, and this plant does such a big job, and it's so helpful. I hope you've enjoyed seeing the plants that I have grown from seed, especially the little vinca, and saves children's lives. Goodbye.
Well, Roisin, it's new to me that vinca could be used in that way. And I'm glad to hear that it's helping in your treatment, and I hope it's going well. And thanks very much for sending us that lovely film. Now, this is where I took the rosemary out last week, and this is where I want to put the alchemilla. And the idea being that it will spill over the path. At the moment, of course, they're pretty insignificant. These are small plants, but even so, give them room to grow. So I'm spacing these about 8 or 9 inches apart, planting them at the height they were in the soil. Up there. And this looks like nothing, but believe you me, it will very quickly get established. This is a brilliant time of year for moving plants. Right, I'll plant up the other side. In all my gardening, I'm constantly tinkering in trying to get the right combinations, the right mixes, I suppose even just the right feel. But I know for many gardeners that their inspiration comes from attention to detail in one particular plant group. And we went to Berkshire to see a man about his cacti.
I don't like to think of myself as obsessive, but I do get into hobbies quite full on. I'm Martin. I've been a live sound engineer for quite a few years. I drive bands on tour. I've played in bands, metal mostly, played in a few punk bands. My partner Trixie bought me a little green cactus.
I'm Trixie. I love gardening very much. Being out in nature and birds, flowers, you know, I just love it. It's great. Martin wasn't really into gardening when I met him, and then I bought him one cactus.
This is the plant. It's a Machicana madisonorium, and things progressed from there.
Martin being Martin, the whole thing just exploded and we've ended up with, I don't know, close to 1,000 cactuses in the back garden, which is quite funny. Maybe I should have bought him like a Shetland pony or something, and then I'd have a whole garden full of ponies, but instead I got cactuses, so oh well.
I had windowsills full of these little plants, and spring came around and they all started to flower, which blew my mind because I'd never actually seen a cactus flower before, so then I got really into them. First thing I'd do is take them out of the pot to have a look at the roots. So you can see there's definitely evidence of mealybugs. The white fluff that they produce, they're sucking insects. They latch onto the body or the root of the plant and they just slowly sit there and suck all the nutrients out of it. Some people just sort of spray them and they'll appear to have gone, but they'll come back. So I usually physically remove them by spraying them with soap and hosing them down until they're clear. Let them dry and then pot them up again. Keep an eye on them. Well, they're just such resilient plants. I think that's what I find most fascinating about them. They can be neglected, have no water for like a year or more, and although they look dead, they're not, and you can bring them back to life pretty easily. And I think potting them up and cleaning them up and making what was once a horrible looking little scabby plant suddenly grow into a nice looking plant, it's pretty good fun. I got quite good at it. So the soil I use is cat litter mostly. It's 2 parts cat litter, 1 part loam-based compost. It's really good because it absorbs water really quick, which makes watering easy, and it drains fast, and everything's growing really well in it. So to pot this guy up, I use a little bit of shade cloth to cover the hole in the bottom. It's really important that you have a hole in the bottom. And put some of this in. And then just pop him in, and then just fill in around the edges. And I'll use a chopstick to push the soil down. And I'll put some nice top dressing on. This is just lava rock, and it just makes it look nicer. It also helps that it changes colour when you water it. There we go, little stabby potted up. Brutal.
I really like them. I'm a bit upset that I don't have a greenhouse anymore. He's stolen both of them. But yeah, I enjoy them and I like seeing the enjoyment that Martin gets from them. Yeah, so it makes me happy seeing him happy.
Well, this one's pretty interesting. It's a Stenosirius eruca, or its common name is the creeping devil, which is pretty cool. Pretty metal name. They're interesting because they grow lying down, and they actually move across the desert, which is why they're called the creeping devil. As the end dies, the tip carries on growing, so eventually they shuffle along and spread out across the desert. Then they grow new little offsets, and they grow and detach from the mother plant, and they creep off in another direction. You don't need a greenhouse to grow cactus. They grow quite happily in a south-facing window. The thing to keep in mind is they don't like heat in the winter, so sat above a radiator in the winter is pretty bad for them because they continue to try and grow and they don't actually go dormant, and then you need to keep watering them. So if you can put them somewhere cooler in the winter, like in a porch or somewhere like that, then they do really well. Echinopsis are a cool plant for a beginner. They flower amazingly well. They have these huge flowers. There's lots and lots of different hybrids, and they all have different colour flowers, different sizes and shapes. When they flower, it's incredible. They come up at night and they only last a day, but if you look after them well, they'll flower throughout the season. Springtime is the best time for growing cactus. They've been completely dormant and all shriveled up and dry out all winter, and then the first bit of water you give them, they just suddenly burst into life. They swell up and the buds form and the flowers burst open, and it's just really nice to see that. One of my favourites is definitely the Ariocarpus. They're really cool, slow-growing Mexican plants, and they just look really moody. Most of the plant is actually under the ground. They have this huge taproot where they store all the water. The kind of mean-looking plants, in my head, they have this like doom metal soundtrack that goes along with them. I think having plants and just spending time with nature is, you know, really therapeutic. It's good for your mental health. It makes you feel good to nurture and look after these little things. So all of these back here are seedlings from last year. I've just pricked them all out and put them in their own little pots. The Aztecium, these ones are actually 4-year-old seedlings. They grow very, very, very slowly. I'm glad she bought me that cactus.
Yeah, I'm not. No, I am. Sorry. No, sorry, I shouldn't have said that.
Can we do that again?
Yeah, sorry.
Not many of us will ever have anything like as many cacti as that. But the key point, the thing to always remember, is that they do not need heat over winter. Now, we have been keeping our pelargoniums over winter in this greenhouse, and you can see they have started to put on new growth. And if I leave them, they will get very straggly. Now, it can be very nice, that, but if you want a compact plant, you have to prune them now. And those prunings will make great cuttings. And they're one of the easiest plants in the world to take cuttings from. So if I take a straggly plant like this, cut back hard, cut back to a node. So if you can see there's a little leaf there, so I can cut back to that, and back like that, and like that, and that will stimulate new growth. Now look at all this material I've got for cutting. And all you need is a glass of water. Like any cutting, cut below a node, so we have there, like that. Strip off some of the lower leaves, like that. Cut this back a little, and pop it in. And that's all you have to do. I can just leave those here in the greenhouse. You can put them on the windowsill and they will form good roots, and I can pot them up in about a month's time and have some nice new plants. Now, it's time to join Frances, because last summer she went to visit a cut flower grower who grows her plants for a very specific purpose.
Growing your own plants for cut flowers has really grown in popularity. Sadly, cut flowers in a vase will only last a couple of weeks at most. However, there is a way to extend the life of flowers from your garden that will last months, if not years. And that's with dried flowers. Bex Partridge moved to Devon for a complete change of lifestyle and to pursue her passion for dried flowers. This space is lovely, Bex.
Thank you. In full bloom at the moment.
Yeah, it's incredible. So you've grown all these from seed?
Pretty much, yeah. I try as much as I can to grow things from seed. And loads of different umbellifers. I've got some floristil in here, bronze fennel, wild carrot, and perennials as well, I try to.
That's amazing. So, can we cut some? Do you trust me to?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, where should we go?
Let's start with the straw flowers because they're in perfect cutting.
They are beautiful, aren't they?
Yeah.
I love these.
I do as
people
well,
don't.
and there's some beautiful colours now that you can get, really soft pinks and whites, and yeah, it's gorgeous. So what you're looking for when you're cutting your flowers is you want to take the middle top stem, where there's normally a cluster of kind of 3 or 4 flowers, and you're going to cut that and leave any buds that are growing to the side, because that will then grow on to form bigger flowers, which I can then cut, so maximising the plant. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, cool. Nice. All right then. And we're working through this whole patch?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So these are your classic dried flowers, and you can hear that the petals are almost dried when they're on the stem, and that means that they will retain the shape and the colour when they dry. You want to strip the leaves off because they don't dry well at all, and they'll just go a yucky sort of brown colour, so it's best to just strip the leaves off. imagine what's next on the agenda. So I thought we'd cut some seed heads. So I've got flax here, and I love to use seeds and grasses in my displays because it just softens the edges of some of the dried flowers. So that's flax there.
They're so beautiful. I always think it's one of the most underrated plants.
Totally.
You can make fabric from it, you can eat it, you get linseed oil from it. But I did not know that you could also dry it and use it in dried flowers.
And they've got lovely movement, you know. So when you're cutting seed heads, you want to look for them when they're still in the green. So by that I mean, whilst there are some brown seed heads, you've still got some green ones, because if you leave them for too long, basically they're going to go over and all the seeds will burst out and they'll become too brittle.
Okay, I see.
So, same with nigella and things, you want to cut them in the green.
Wow, I will try that next year. These are more perennials, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, which ones are we taking today?
So I think this Sanguisorba is in a good place to be cut. So we can take some stems of that.
Okay.
And with this one, you want to be going quite far down and not worrying too much about any buds coming, so that you get nice, long, tall stems.
Right.
And they do get a bit tangled, so.
Well, they always do Sanguisorba,
Yeah.
don't they? They're so beautiful. I can imagine them drying really well. Do they keep their lovely deep colour
They
when they're
do,
dried?
exactly. And they just make really beautiful additions to a display.
Is there a way of being able to tell when something is at the perfect time to cut?
It's hard to say for sure as a general rule for all flowers, but if you look for something when it's at its peak as a good kind of marker for when it's ready, unless obviously you're looking for something where it's going over to seed and then you'll leave it until it has formed the seed.
Oh, wow. This is amazing. This is your office.
Yes, it's my office, yeah. It's my studio where I create, and it's also where I dry most of my flowers as well.
It's been nice to come to work here.
Yeah.
So I'm just bunching these, I guess.
Yeah, so I normally go for kind of 5 or 10 stems when I'm drying something like this, and we've already stripped the leaves off.
Okay.
Just tie some string around them and we will hang them upside down. What that does is encourage the flower heads to dry down with the stems sturdy.
Okay,
Them.
but you're putting these one into a vase.
Yes, exactly. So with the Sanguisorba, similarly with hydrangeas and something like a gypsophila, they do quite well sitting in a little bit of water in a vase and left to dry for a couple of weeks. And you're not going to get any kind of floppy flower heads with this, and it just encourages them to dry in a natural way. The great thing about it is that you can obviously have it as a display in your home whilst you're waiting for them to dry, and then you can go on and use them if you wanted to in a display or a creation.
And with these ones, you put them in water.
So if I was to have cut them from the field and brought them in and hung them out, I wouldn't have put them in water. But if there's any delay, it's best to just keep them in water, keep them hydrated and in a good condition before you hang them out.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And hanging them, what's the conditions they like?
So you're looking for somewhere that is out of direct sunlight, and that stops the flowers bleaching and becoming too brittle. You want somewhere that's sort of ambient room temperature, not too hot, cold and not too hot. But the key thing is you want somewhere that is free of moisture. This is something that you might not think about drying, but they're buttercups.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
The colour is so incredible.
Isn't it? Such a rich gold. And they're the field variety, the ones that grow really, really tall in the meadows.
Yeah.
And obviously you need quite a lot of them because they shrink, but they're just beautiful. I love them.
So then how do you display these once they've all dried?
I make things like I've got this display here, which is just in an open-necked vessel.
That's lovely.
As you can see, I've used lots of different textures and tones of flowers.
That's beautiful. How long would you expect that to last for?
It's kind of the whole of the winter. If it's inside, somewhere not windy as well, ideally. Another way to display them is to press them, and then you can use those pressings either on the wall or potentially on a card that you might want to send someone. And it's kind of forgotten art, but yeah, a really beautiful way to preserve your flowers.
Absolutely. I feel so inspired to just try this. I've never done it before, so just seeing all of this, there's so much to think about. So thank you for showing me a whole new world of plants, really.
You're welcome.
We do keep dried seed heads and display them all winter, but you know, we've never tried dried flowers here at Longmeadow. I think it's time to start. Now, still to come on today's programme. We visit a garden that works in perfect harmony with its dry, impoverished soil.
There is no watering, there is no feeding, we don't dig it over, we don't fork it over. The idea is to create a self-sustaining ecosystem.
And Sue will be delving into new and intriguing ways of growing veg in containers.
I'm doing an experiment growing green veg using an old pillow and old t-shirts and some kitchen waste.
But first, Rachel tells us everything we need to know to grow beautiful hellebores.
Flowering from late winter to early spring, hellebores are mostly hardy, compact and easy to grow. These striking plants come in a range of colours and provide early nectar for pollinating insects. They're happy to grow in partial shade, and their usually evergreen leaves provide interest all year round. Hellebore heads nod downwards. It's a clever ploy to keep pollen and nectar dry for the first of the spring pollinators. They can be single or double in a range of pinks, purples, yellows and whites, and can be spotted or speckled. They don't have petals, instead modified sepals. The actual petals have been fused to form tube-like nectaries. These are the specialised nectar-producing structures of the flower. Full of sugary water, they're much loved by the first bees of the season. Plant them in spring near the front of a border where they have a little sun for part of the day. They're woodland edge plants and thrive in rich, moisture-retentive soil and will struggle in extreme wet or dry conditions. They can also be raised in pots in a loam-based compost. Once planted, hellebores hate being moved, so leave them be. To enjoy them at their best, cut off all the old leaves just as the flowers begin to emerge.
What we find now here at Longmeadow is that hellebores start popping up where they really want to be, which tends to be in amongst hedges or under shrubs, and they are just one of the great stars of this time of year. Now, a job that I don't do every year, but needs doing regularly, every 2 or 3 years, are cutting back dogwood to get a flush of new growth that has the best coloured stems. And the best time to do it is either just before or just as you start to see the leaves appear. The other day I did the bright red Cornus alba westernburt, and this one I actually haven't cut for a few years. It's Cornus sericea flaviramea, and it's got lovely yellowy green stems. The crucial thing when you're pruning Cornus, or willow will do just the same, for the colour of its bark is to prune hard. Be brave. So we'll get right down in here and start off cutting here, like that. Let's pull this away and see what we've got. Now that will regrow, and next February, March, we'll get stunning, vibrant, yellowy green stems. Now, with the cut material, take the best of it and put it in a vase. It looks fantastic. And actually will start to sprout leaves and make a really good display. And also, it gives you limitless cuttings, because this just takes so easily. If we just take a section like this, and then using my secateurs, I just cut off the top like that, that will make a new plant very easily, simply by sticking in the ground. About 2/3 of its length, and the chances of that rooting are very high indeed. Now, we're going to visit another of your gardens, and this time it takes us to the county of my childhood, Hampshire.
Hi, we're Sid and Sue, and welcome to Twin Oaks, our garden in Hampshire.
These are pitcher plants, Sarracenia. A lot of people think they're tropical plants. They come from North America, but they are fine in this country right through the year. The pond in the winter freezes over. These stay out here and they're fine. They can survive it, no problem at all. All that happens is in the spring, you will see that the tips of the trumpets will have died off a bit. So all you need to do is just take the trumpet off like that. Leave the main part there because there's still flies inside that are giving nutrition to the plants.
We try to be a bit wildlife friendly, and the latest addition is a bug hotel. Underneath is an open space that hopefully, through this tunnel, hedgehogs will find their way in and make their home in the winter. Here we are by the wildlife pond where the Clematis montana is absolutely in its best at the moment, and we absolutely love it here. I hope you've enjoyed the visit here and enjoy your gardens as much as we enjoy ours.
Certainly my experience of Sarracenias is that they will take quite low temperatures. I've had mine outside on the edge of the pond when the pond has been frozen solid and the whole of the roots and the pot that they're in has been just a block of ice, and they've been fine, down to -7. Although I do keep them in the greenhouse because that's where they catch flies for me. Now the pond here in the damp garden is, like everything else at Longmeadow, poised for action. And it's quite a good time just to do a little bit of tidying up. I say a little bit because the first thing obviously to be aware of is to make sure that there are no tadpoles. And all I'm going to do is just skim a little bit of the weed off. Now this weed is mainly a result of the fallen leaves and dead vegetation in the water, which rots down and enriches the water. And the first thing to respond to that enrichment is the weed. So gently take it out, and then as always with a pond, don't just take it away straight away, but tip it out on the edge gently so any small dragonfly larvae or beetles or anything at all can crawl back into the water. Now, we went to visit Tom Nielsen in his garden in Somerset, which has been created magnificently from a very unlikely beginning.
I always enjoy coming through this space. The moment I go out of the door, I feel connected to the natural world. I find myself suddenly transported to a different place. My name's Tom, and this is my garden on the site of a ruined cottage in West Somerset. When we first came to the site, the whole thing was a mass of ivy and brambles and elder, but it had this wild, romantic quality to it that I wanted to preserve. Here on the site we're on a very nutrient-poor sandstone-based soil, and this was further impoverished as part of the building process of building the barn when we brought some stone onto site. The standard horticultural way of doing things would have been to remove this entire top layer and bring in lots of nutrient-rich soil. What I wanted to do was to steer clear of that path, because I think that you can get more interesting results by staying true to the underlying character of your site. And that's what we've tried to do here. I want the planting to look healthy, to be healthy, and to have a feel that it's enjoying growing where it's growing. It's not just about struggling through. So there are lots of plants that have thrived in these challenging conditions, really dry, hot summers and wet winters. So things that have done well include Stipa gigantea, Eryngium pandanifolium, the native fennel. But one thing I'd really recommend anybody with dry, poor soil conditions growing is Althea cannabina. This is a malvid from southern Europe which has absolutely loved the poor conditions and has tolerated the winter wet with no problems at all. It's big, it's airy, and it's much loved by bees particularly. Often new build houses will have poor soil in the garden, builder's rubble with a thin layer of topsoil scraped over the top. This is pretty similar to what I had in a way. One good way of seeing what works is by using seeds. You can get packets of seeds for not much money and broadcast them, and then for the first year or so you'll have something to look at, you'll have something beautiful, but it'll also be a guide for you for later years. You'll see which of the seeds work, which don't. In the centre of our site there's an old ruined cottage which has been here for hundreds of years. When we cleared out the interior here, we wanted to do something a little bit different with it. It's got a very sheltered microclimate. The walls are surrounding it on pretty much four sides. So it provides a bit of a buffer, a bit of a kind of sheltered nook for lots of plants that wouldn't necessarily grow well elsewhere. Things like this dahlia. We've got Dacia personata here. We've got a nice fig growing lushly here, and a hardy kiwi over there, which is fruiting for the first time for me. After planting, the garden is incredibly low maintenance. The only real maintenance is a bit of weeding. I do have to pull out a few dandelions because they do seed in everywhere. There is no watering, there is no feeding. We don't dig it over, we don't fork it over. The idea is to create a self-sustaining artificial ecosystem that functions as a wild one would do. There are some trade-offs with growing in this way. You will get slower growth initially, and this is the key thing. The lower nutrient levels, the lower levels of moisture, and just the slightly harsher conditions that the plants are growing in means that plants will develop at a much slower rate, particularly if you put them in as small plants, which I always advocate you do. The benefit of this in the long term is that the plants will live for longer. An example here is a small Lactica perennis, which is growing in the sand and rock. This went in as a small plug plant in the spring and has put on, I would say, maybe 4 or 5 leaves. This is the same plant that was out in the dry garden. These were planted at exactly the same time. Here in this nursery bed with improved soil, it's a much bigger plant. It's much further on in its life cycle. This just demonstrates the differences in growing conditions and what they mean for a plant. I'm guessing probably the plant will burn itself out over the course of maybe 2 or 3 years, whereas the one growing in harsher conditions in the gravel, in the sand out there, will be a much more longer-lived plant. So if you're growing a dry garden, if you're growing plants in harsher conditions, you might need a bit more patience to get to the stage you want to get to, but it will have positive impacts in terms of the long-term health of the plant. I think it's incredibly important that a garden is stable and robust enough to exist in a changing climate. I feel uncomfortable just keeping on irrigating more or adding more nutrients. We can be better than that. We can provide more than just a garden. It can be a place where ourselves and the natural world can intermingle.
There's no doubt about it that the healthiest plants are those that adapt best to any given situation. And I think that that garden looks really beautiful and is very inspiring. From the sublime to the very ordinary, because it's now time to plant broad beans. And broad beans are one of the very few vegetables that you can put into relatively cold soil and they will germinate and grow. If you're sowing them in a raised bed, you can sow them in a grid. If you're sowing them in open ground, you want to have double rows, about 9 inches apart, and with room between the rows so that you can walk down. And this is a variety called Red Epicure, and so you have these lovely red beans. So look, Ned, look how nice that is. No, not for you. And I just push them into the soil. So we go about that far apart. Right, all I have to do now is just rake that over to cover them. And that is it for the moment. These will germinate, depending on the weather, in a few weeks' time, grow strongly, and they should be ready to harvest in June. Now, we're off to Swansea to visit Sue in her garden, where she's doing a number of spring jobs to prepare the garden for summer.
At this time of year, I try to get a head start on spring. I like to do lots of little jobs in short bursts, which won't wear me out, so that I can avoid rush hour later in spring, when everything is happening so fast that I can't keep up. And this year, I'm really excited to try out a few new experiments, starting with my lawn. This lawn has seen a lot of play, but the children have long since left home, and I want to do something a bit more interesting with it. Well, so I've taken off all the turf, and I'm going to try and attempt to create a wild white border. And I've got oxeye daisies, ammy and foxgloves. I've sown most of it in the autumn, and I want this ethereal wild look. So I'm going to lay out my plants as if they've self-seeded. So these lovely oxeye daisies really love the sun. And then the ammy don't need quite so much sun. They're desperate to get out of their pots. And then the foxgloves are going to go in the darker part. I'm spacing them far apart so they've got lots of room to develop. I love this tool. I got it for Christmas. It's an auger, a builder's tool. I find it easier than a bulb planter. It just makes a nice hole really easily. There's one. My goal is for the bed to look wild and natural, while it's actually carefully contrived by me. I want to get the feel that it is a meadow, so I've come up with a cunning plan of using chicken feed, which is a lot of grasses, corn grasses and wheat grasses and barley grasses. I've mixed in some fairy flax, white flaxseed and some white poppies. It'll look beautiful. It'll also support the slightly delicate ammy and the oxeye daisies. It's very exciting having an idea and seeing if it'll work or not. The birds are going to love it, so I need to rake over some soil to disguise what I've done. I'll give my chicken feed-inspired wild border a thorough water later on today, and if my experiment works, I might extend the strip even further across the lawn in future. I love container growing because it's easy for me to pick the vegetables at height. But some of my containers need reinvigorating, and I do this job in the spring. This year, more than ever, I'm repurposing and recycling, and I'm doing an experiment growing green veg using an old pillow, an old t-shirt, and some kitchen waste. But first I've got to prepare the containers. Now these containers are quite deep and they take a lot of compost and need a lot of watering. And compost is quite expensive and watering's quite hard work. So I'm creating a wicking system at the bottom, so I'll need less soil. The containers have got holes in, so I've got to line them with plastic and putting pots in to create the reservoir of water. I'm going to part fill the container with water now. Now I'm going to line it with an old t-shirt. Got too many holes in. So I'm going to tuck it in nice and snug so the t-shirt meets the water and then it wicks it up and damps the whole t-shirt and then to the next layer above. But this one, this is a cotton covered feather pillow and you can only use natural fibres for this. The feathers are full of keratin. As it rots down, releases nitrogen. It's feeding the plants, it's acting as a wicking system, and it's also taking up a nice bit of space where I don't have to use soil. In this one, I'm going to put in some raw kitchen waste, which is a bit whiffy. This one is for peas and beans. I'm using a mixture of garden compost. There's a bit of sand in there, and there's a bit of old compost from what was in here already. I'm doing it to about 20 centimetres. I'll be planting in about 6 to 8 weeks, and my peas rarely make it down to the kitchen as I can't resist them while I'm harvesting them.
After covering my old pillow with soil, I'm ready to sow.
I've chosen beetroot to sow here, and I've chosen a variety called Morello. I do like to get as much as I can from anything I grow, and Morello is going to give me 3 points of harvest. The leaves for salad, I can harvest the stems and the beetroot itself. I love eating beetroot. I love juicing it and popping it in with orange and ginger. An absolute breakfast favourite in our house. Right, job done, and I'm off to do some more. I love to find 1 or 2 plants that I don't know how they're going to work out. And I've discovered 2 that definitely fit the bill. This area was completely covered with vinca. It's very shady, and so I needed to find plants that would cope in the shade, but I didn't want the usual suspects. And I've chosen this lovely plant called a sausage vine. Now, who doesn't like a sausage? And it's a twining plant, so it needs to go right up against the wall. They have beautiful flowers on in the spring, and then they'll produce really lovely sausage-shaped, purple-coloured fruits, if I'm lucky, towards the autumn, and they're edible.
Now I'm going to twine the plant up on its supporting wire.
My second plant is a Selene fimbriata. It's also got a beautiful other name as a fringed flowered campion, and it likes shade, so it's very suitable. I like the sausage vine for this area. And lovely little white flowers. I have almost like rah-rah skirts on them, so I'm hoping it's going to be very pretty. This was my phormium bed, and they cascaded over the steps, making it quite difficult to get up and down. My husband's had a bit of a health and safety moment, so we're redesigning it so that we can create less steep steps, all this area behind me. He is very keen on red, and I'm not so keen. But I'm going to create him a lovely red border because it's hidden from view behind the garage. So I'm going to go off to my potting shed and make some plans.
Well, just as Sue is doing, now is a time of year when we're all planning for summer and doing jobs and trying to sort of prepare the garden for the big event. But sometimes I think it's worth just stopping and just actually making the most of the moment right now as it is. For example, here in the jewel garden, it may seem as though there's not much happening, but I love that sense of anticipation, of expectation. And every day there are more green shoots, and in many ways that gives me as much pleasure as high summer. It's all part of the performance. Now, the weekend is approaching, and here are some jobs for you. Now is a good time to sow lettuce seed for an early summer harvest, and this is one of my favourite varieties, Lovejoy's Cos. Sow the seed thinly on a tray of compost. Cover them lightly, I'm using vermiculite, but more compost will do the job fine. Water them well and put them somewhere warm to germinate, and the seedlings will be ready to plant out in about 5 or 6 weeks' time. One of the best things you can do for your garden at this time of year is to mulch any bare soil in your borders. It doesn't really matter what you use as long as it's organic, and I'm using bark around the grasses. But whatever you choose to use, be generous. Put a thick layer, because this will not only suppress weeds, but keep in moisture. If you've stored dahlia tubers over winter, or you've bought some now, check them over carefully. Make sure that there is no rot or that the tubers haven't dried up too much. And if they're plump and firm, pot them up now into some compost. Put them somewhere warm with light and they will grow on. And then you can plant them out when the risk of frost is over, so they've got a head start. Come on. Come along. The weather hasn't been very kind so far this month. We've had snow and ice and flood and storm and wind and rain, but the just occasional touches of warm spring sunshine make you realise it's going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. And of course, this Sunday, the clocks go forward. So everything gets better. I love this moment. Now, I shan't be here next week. You'll be with Adam in his garden, but I'll see you back here at Longmeadow with the sun shining and spring leaping forwards in 2 weeks' time. Till then, bye-bye.